Welcome to the MAM Journals. Today I'm going to be talking about the Kawasaki ZRX1100, and as I already have a 1200, it would make sense to compare it. When I sort of did some initial research when I was thinking about buying one of these, one of the perpetual debates that comes up, well, what's the differences, do they ride the same? And the general consensus is that this bike steers quicker and that this bike has got more power. Now, obviously when we get to engine specs, we'll quickly get to the point where we'll know that this one has got more power. But if this does steer more quickly, I think one of the things that I'd like to know is why. What are the actual differences? The differences are subtle between the bikes, but there are differences and you can feel them. If I was clever enough to be able to ride a bike blindfold, I would be able to tell you which bike I was riding very quickly by the characteristics of its riding experience. So I will be talking a little bit about that. Also talk about the specs and history and where it went, maybe touch on a little bit of the competitors, and then the sort of the million-dollar question we've all got. If I didn't already own this and had my time again, which bike would I buy and why? I hope you enjoy the video. Okay, so before we get into sort of engine specifications and more detail, just a sort of general background on the bike. This bike, the 1100, was launched in Europe in '97. It was the bike before it was the Zephyr and hadn't sold particularly well in America, and therefore it sort of delayed their entry into the American market. I don't think they came out in America until 1999. During the year 2000, they were developing this bike, the 1200, and it was launched in 2001. In Europe, this continued until 2006. I know that because this is called an A6F, and the 6 actually designates the year. The 7s were Japanese market only. So they actually were, both bikes were actually on sale for longer time, and then they were actually in production because there was a lot of stock around, and it gradually took time to get them through. So you can see quite late registrations of both of these bikes. This bike is actually, despite the fact it's a 2006 bike, was a 2008 registered, and I know that I've certainly come across the bike that was 2009 registered. So clearly they weren't exactly flying out the showroom, despite the fact that they were very good value. In terms of colours, this one came out initially I think it was silver and purple, sort of flat colours. Well, I've seen all sorts of colours. I've seen blacks, I've seen blues, I've seen reds, metallic pink, but the ones that sell are the green ones, and I guess that is because of the Eddie Lawson sort of connotation stroke connection in its mind as a classic muscle bike that harking back to the days of the 70s. But of course it's got significantly more well, more power than the road bikes, less power than the race bikes did at the time. But they made a couple of versions. This version with the bikini fairing, obviously known as the R for both. They also made a round headlight version for both bikes, which appeared in certain markets, and they were naked. And then for this one they also had what's called an S version, which was a sort of three-quartered faired version. It's definitely the R's that are most popular, and the greens are, of the R's, the most sought after. One thing you should look at if you're thinking about buying one of these, a number of people converted their bikes from, you know, they bought one with a different colour and then they've painted it up, which isn't a problem, but it'd be nice if the registration document actually referred to the fact that it is green rather than the red it was originally or whatever colour it was derived from. Both of these bikes are in their original specification, and there's a couple of mods on that which I'll talk through as I go through that, and this one is virtually standard. So without any further ado, let's get on to the specifications. We'll start with the 1100. Okay, I like to start with the engine, and this is the 1100 has got a 1052 cc. It's a liquid cooled 4-cylinder. They call it retuned, but I think that's the marketing department getting the better of themselves. It's a detuned ZX11, which used to produce 145 brake horsepower, and was an aluminium frame bike with peaky sports bike performance, but they shoehorned the engine into this with a conventional steel frame. The engine produces 98 Newton meters of torque at 7,000 revs, so when they tuned it. They increased the torque to give it more sort of like a rideable muscle bike feel to it rather than the peaky sports bike feel. Top brake horsepower is 104.6 at 8,700. Whilst we're looking at the engine, that's got conventional liners on, and if people are thinking about modifying bikes, that has certain attractions if you're feeling like you want to put big bore kits on. We should probably, although I've covered it in other videos, and it might be better if you were looking at that particular issue to just go to one of the other videos rather than me just reiterate what I've already covered. There's the starter chain mechanism. It comes up in most forums, and clearly that's under here, and there's a chain in there, and it's got a tensioner on it, which if it doesn't, it can sometimes catch on the outer edge of the clutch basket, and particularly if obviously when you're pulling in the clutch you're making the basket open, and it gets that basket even closer and it gets nicks on it, and there are various modifications to be done. This one remarkably is virtually unmarked, and mine, the 1200, was quite marked, and I've actually done a lot of work on it, but there is a video that covers that in itself. So if we then look at the 1200, so what have we got there? Well, you'd think, oh well, 1200, that'd be based on the ZX12, but that'd be far too logical. It's actually based on the same engine. It's just a bigger bore to it. That's 1164, again liquid cooled, but that produces 112 newton meters, so 14 newton meters more than the 1100 at the same revs. The ZX12, by the way, was 1199cc, which tells you it wasn't really based on that, and that produces 122 brake horsepower at 8,500 revs, so slightly lower revs. I've actually had this dyno tested, and this is producing 107 at the back wheel. I always work simplistically. You take about 10% off from front to back with a chain, and about 15% with a shaft drive. Obviously these are both chain driven bikes. The difference in terms of, and I mentioned conventional liners on the other one, this has got Nickel plating and protection inside, which is one of the reasons why technically it's quite difficult to modify. It can be done, but it's a lot more expense than just boring out a conventional liner. So let's touch on some other things. I'm looking at this one. Let's talk about wheels, forks and swing arms. And wheels, they both bikes are on 17-inch wheels, and they've got that black 3-spoke reminiscent of Eddie Lawson days. Nice sort of nod back to heritage. They've both got 120 and 70 profile tyres on the front, and on the rear the 1100's got a 5-inch rim and 170/60 profile tyre, which is a difference, and the 1200 is a 5.5-inch 180/55 profile tyre. The wheelbase on the bike is the 1100 is a shorter bike, and it's 57.09. That's tyre contact to tyre contact, and the 1200 is 57.7, and most of that is as a result of the different swinging arms. That swinging arm, just to confuse the measures and keep us off the pace, that swinging arm is 15 millimeters longer than that one on the 1100, so that this swing arm is longer and more sturdy, and that explains some of the differences in terms of handling, which I'll get to later. I think a lot of people say, well, those differences are so small, but I learnt very early on in life, the hard way to be honest, what differences geometry make. As a younger man, I actually rode a little bit of Clubman Enduro, not at any great level, but I certainly enjoyed myself, and my first Enduro bike was a PE175, and I enjoyed riding it, and I actually made some quite good progress through the woods, and God forbid used to actually overtake people. But as soon as I got out into the open, everything that I'd overtaken would come pouring past me, being one, had a lot more power, and two, a lot more stable out in the open at higher speeds. So I thought I'd cure that, so I went and bought myself a Husqvarna WR240 and converted it to enduro use, and that was certainly solved the problem out in the open. It was as fast as anything else that I was competitive with. I could certainly hold my own and get there, and it was very stable across rough ground. But when you got to the trees, the differences in the geometry made a significant difference. I mean, boy, did I hit a lot of trees in the first couple of times out, because it simply didn't turn anything like the PE. So that was a physical way that I learnt that little differences in geometry makes huge differences in handling. Talking about the brakes on the bike, they're the same dimensions on both. The front's got two pots, two discs with 6 pots. They're 310 mils on both bikes. Slightly different shrouding or centre plates, as you can see on them, and they're obviously non-ABS bikes. That was not a characteristic fitted to the bikes at that time. And at the rear they've got 252 pots. The brakes I would describe as they're okay. People do change the front, because these Tokyo, the 6 pots can take a bit of maintenance. They sort of corrode up a bit, because obviously there's a lot of moving parts in there, so you do need to keep them clean. If you just wanted to slightly improve the brakes, or you're considering taking it on track day or something like, you might want to change the pads, but that's an individual choice. So let's talk about suspension. Well, both of these bikes are heavy. The 1100 is slightly lighter, 490 dry versus 492. 545 pounds versus 540, so there's not much difference in terms of the weight. Both of the bikes are standard, come with what I would describe as a soggy front end. They are fully adjustable, i.e. you can do preload, rebound and compression, very similar mechanism. And I actually, when I bought this, I did play about with it to try and do that, but I managed to turn it from soggy to skittish, so I didn't really feel I was getting anywhere. So I then actually had some professional help from PDQ in Slough, and Larry Webb, who is very knowledgeable on these bikes, and he just said, no, let's upgrade the springs and clear out the mud that you call oil in the bottom of those forks and start again. And that has made a huge difference to that sponginess and that initial dive when you're trying to stop 545 pounds in a hurry. The rear suspension at a glance is the same, the KYB units, and again they're adjustable for preload, compression, and down at the bottom on this bike it's on the inside, and on the 1200 it's actually on the outside, in terms of that adjustability. But again, it's you're working with fairly basic units, and you're trying to get a bike to be able to cope with quite a lot of weight, so it's not, handling and suspension isn't the strongest characteristic of the bike, but it is very good at what I call ordinary speeds. Right, the front geometry of the bike and these forks, at a glance, and looking at the handbooks for both, they're both 25 degrees and they're both the same diameter, but the yoke part numbers are different on this, because one thing unfortunately I'm very curious as a person, and I couldn't understand the trail, i.e. the amount of front of that opposite angle front wheel contact is 104 mil on this and 106 on the 1200. Now, very simply, the more trail you've got, the more stable the bike, but I couldn't understand how, with what appeared to be the same setup, then how do you get a different trail? And a little bit of investigation, the differences are in the yokes. The yokes are different part numbers, which suggests to me they're slightly different, which allows for that only 2 mil increase in the trail. at the front end, but as a combination of small characteristics can end up to a noticeable difference in handling. Okay, so let's just talk about engine finishes, just the last sort of aesthetics difference. All right, as you can see on the 1200, it's got this I suspect it's magnesium look-alike covers on it. I've actually got a Honda SP1 which genuinely is magnesium, but I'd be surprised at the budget price that these were if they put that sort of expensive metal in. But again, please, if anyone says no, it is really magnesium, just let me know. I welcome the exchange of information. Both, this one has obviously got the black finish. These fins, of course, these here are purely aesthetic. It's a liquid cooled bike, but it is a nice effect and captures some of the bikes of old traditions. And one of the things I do like about the bikes, as I think you probably can tell I'm quite fond of them as a model, is I like the fact it just harks back to different earlier times whilst offering a modern level of service and sophistication. Both the bikes are fitted with 36mm Cayenne carburetors, and in terms of one of the challenges with carburetor bikes, of course, and I think it was virtually the last of the carburetors, most fuel injection was well and truly on its way by then, is they do take a bit more looking after and balancing, and you've got to make sure nowadays with ethanol fuel you don't leave them stored. Ethanol fuel's fine as long as you actually burn it, but you leave it for any length of time, and of course it separates, and the last place you want it separating and creating sludges in your carburetors if you've got 4 old style carburetors in a row. But I personally have taken the view, in the UK we can actually still buy fuel which is non-ethanol, and it's SO Supreme in most parts of the UK has got no ethanol in it, and I prefer that approach to obviously putting something with ethanol in and then putting something else in to treat the ethanol when you leave it. But be careful how you store the bikes if you only use them occasionally. Right, so what were they like to ride? Well, as a result of the small technical changes, the trail, the swinging arm and the tyres, this bike is definitely quicker to turn, and I deliberately rode on roads I'm familiar with and rode the bikes back to back, and small mini roundabouts, you wouldn't describe it as a chicane because obviously it's on the road, but roads which have a series of bends in them, this is definitely quicker to turn, and those small changes would make a difference. In terms of the power, yes, you do feel the extra power. You can feel it through the revs. Both bikes are massive power. They are a talky bike and they have got good power from sort of 3,000 revs onwards, but there were other bikes in the market that probably had more grunt lowdown. I mean, it really gets going at that 7,000 revs point. This one probably runs out of steam a little bit quicker in terms of feeling the power input, although its power is 8,750 while peak power at that is on 8.5. You'll probably get a little bit more out of revving this. Neither bikes are delivering much more up towards the red line at 10,000 revs, and so if you're holding out there, you're doing it for fun rather than actually looking for performance, you'd get a bit more change in earlier. But yes, you can definitely feel the power and the urgency in this. This one feels like it spins up a bit quicker, so feels a bit more responsive, but in real terms this one's actually delivering the power output. Both of these bikes are what I would call a proper muscle bike. They're great fun to ride, they're sensible and easy to ride. I'm not, and just I think I always like to make it clear, I'm not a fast rider. I would describe myself as an average rider who occasionally is brisk, and when I get to the brisker moments I do find both of these bikes have the same handling characteristics. I would describe it as scuttle when you're pressing on a bit and got it cranked over, and whilst they're reasonably good with undulations parallel to your direction of travel. They really don't like transverse undulations, i.e. coming across the road, because it destabilizes the front and then destabilizes the back, and the suspension simply isn't quick enough to keep up with it. So what do people do is, when they're actually looking for more, people say, well, how do you make it go faster? And sometimes people assume, well, you just get more power. Well, actually, neither of these bikes, and it's not the engine that stops you going fast. For most average riders, you'll run out of chassis before you've run out of engine. So if you do want to make these ride faster, the thing that I most commonly see is people change the front suspension. They put cartridges in the front, and they change these perhaps to a set of Öhlins, and improve the handling that way, which will make it a more rideable bike. Experts, and we all know it, we've all met them, they can ride anything fast, and if you're really fast on one of these, you will be ballistic on something that's got a bit better suspension and a bit better handling. But it can be done. But for most of us who've developed an aversion for hospital food, there becomes a limit where discretion becomes a better part of valor. So they are, say, good handling bikes, ridden normally. If people are looking for a little bit of extra power, then what they tend to do, just changing exhaust makes a little bit of difference. And Akrapovics seem to be, originally Kirkers were the thing, but I was talking to engineers who do a lot of work on them. They say they get more consistent results out of Akrapovics than they do out of the modern Kirkers or equivalents. So there's plenty of option there, which will give you a bit more power. But as I say, you want to go faster, sort the chassis and suspension out rather than look for extra power. But if you are looking to modify a bike, then I would say that internally this one would make a more obvious choice, because one, you'd buy it at a better price, and secondly, because it's going to be slightly older, and if you're modifying it, then you're not too worried about how many miles it's done or various other things. You can just buy the bike as a base bike and then work your way from there. I've got to say, I'm a member of the number of the ZRX groups, and I attend a few of their sort of group meetings. I've seen some phenomenally well engineered bikes, and which clearly people have put a huge amount of time, effort and skill into, and I really respect them. It doesn't increase the value of the bikes. I mean, you're looking at a guy who's taken an 650 Interceptor and put it into 865. It's probably cost me £4,000. If I get half of that back when I come back to sell it, I've walked on water, because I just know that modifications like that are so personal. But it is good fun doing it, so I'm certainly not anti anybody modifying bikes. But most of my views, most of my bikes, I like them as original as possible, because they do tend to keep their value, or indeed in some cases, if you're interested in such things, they do either keep it or indeed increase their value. I don't buy bikes to make money. I buy bikes because I like them, and then if I'm lucky, some of them go up, some of them go down, and I get out with a relatively cheap hobby. Okay, so what would you pay for something like these? Well, I'm talking really about sort of original bikes. This is a 6,000 mile bike. This is a 16,000 mile. I'm the second owner. That's had, I think it's probably 3, maybe 4 owners, but is in pretty much original condition. A couple of things that aren't original. People recognise that long screen. That's a pyramid screen. That's not standard, but the period one, you can still get these. They just fit on, bolt on there. This has got this carbonised look hugger on, which isn't standard, and obviously this has got these big bungs on it, but essentially it's a standard bike. Now, one of those, if you could get hold of one privately, would probably be 6-ish if you could find one. But I mean, this one's actually owned by a friend of mine, Robert Rooney, who's a well, he used to be a Ducati and a Triumph dealer, but he's become a bit more discerning over time, and he now no longer operates within the franchise environment. So he runs a business called the Motorcycle Barn, and he sells bikes he likes. If he doesn't like him, he won't sell them. So the fact that he's got that tells you that he holds it in high regard. And I think a dealer price, you probably have to pay as much as £7,000. People say to me, oh, when the prices are high, they'll all drop. I think they will drop on the high mileage ones. I'm not sure that people who have nice ones like this will be letting them go back. They're normally in a position to just stick them in the garage and they'll wait until the market comes back. So I think if you're looking for a nice one, my experience is, having bought a fair few bikes over the years, I say I've had 40 bikes. My wife laughs and says I'm mathematically challenged, and it's probably more like 60. And every time I bought an older bike, slightly tattier, I've always regretted it. I've always wished that I just, in the first place, just wrote a bigger check and got the one I actually wanted. This one, I think I've seen them in nice condition, nice original condition like this. They sort of 7 and a bit. I bought it off the original owner. I paid slightly more than that because again, just reiterating my view, really, it was the bike I wanted. He wasn't going to sell it me for quite what I wanted, so I'll just pay the money, and it won't worry me, because I think this bike, I thought I'd be keeping it quite nice low mileage, to be honest, but I thought I'll do, like a number of my bikes, I'll just do 300 miles a year on it and just to enjoy it, keep the seals lubricated, and just enjoy the odd blast. But if I tell you in the first year I've done 1,300 miles and I haven't finished yet, it tells you how much regard I hold this bike in. It's great fun to ride. Both of these bikes are phenomenal bikes to ride. They're really iconic bikes in my view. There were better bikes, I think, things like the FZ1, this around this period, was more power, better handling, better well-sorted suspension, but I don't think they've got the appeal and the historical heritage that these bikes have even today, and I can see them holding their value as they grow in their value, and people enjoy owning it. You rarely turn up at a car park when I stop for a cafe cup of tea without somebody coming across and talking about what it is and how they do it. So I think you can tell I'm an enthusiast and passionate supporter of these bikes. Right, so the $1 million question: which bike would I buy? Well, I've already bought this, so my decision's been made. But if I had my time again, hadn't come across this bike, and I came across this bike, I would be equally happy with the 1100. They are different in characteristics, but they are both superb muscle bikes and great bikes of their period, time and heritage. The ones that I would buy going forward, I would buy the nicest bike that I could find and not worry about whether it's an 1100 or a 1200, and just buy something on its condition, its mileage and its authenticity, rather than be too hung up on the model differentials. I would much rather have a nice one of these than a tatty one of those. So hopefully that gives you some sort of guidance, but if you have got one of these, do not feel you're being in any way deprived of the other, and equally, if you've got a 1200, you've got a great bike. I would like to express my thanks to Robert Rooney for lending me the bike. It is for sale if you want, at the Motorcycle Barn, if you want to contact him. Very kind of him to let me do it. I was a bit cheeky in asking him to do it, but we go back a lot of years, and I have bought a few bikes off him after the years, so he was very kind of him to do that. I'd also like to thank Larry at PDQ for some technical insight, because I just had to get to the bottom of why that steers quicker, and he did help me with certainly identifying the part numbers being different and on the front yokes, so that was really helpful. And I'd also like to thank members of the forum. I put up a few sort of video photographs and asking for people for comments and observations, and as they always do, people came up with some helpful observations and comments, which has helped me make this video, so thank you to you as well. I do hope that you've enjoyed this video, and if you did, maybe you'd press like or even subscribe to the channel, but whether you do any of that, what I do hope you do is you ride safe and you stay well.